Welcome to Chapter 14, Personality. Slide 2. Okay, so I need you to put on your science fiction hats for a moment and imagine a world. A world where thoughts, memories, and consciousness can be transferred from one human body to another. If it were possible for, say, the mind of person A to be put into the body of person B, what would that do to the identity of the two people involved? Slide 3. Would that new person with the mind of A and the body of B be more like person A or B? Would the identity of person A as an accountant, rabbi, or prince, the musician, somehow change if their thoughts, memories, and consciousness were transferred into person B, who may have a different identity based on a life of being a construction worker, truck driver, or homeless? Would they become some amalgam of the two, a homeless rabbi, maybe? In laying out a much more complicated theory about identity than we have time to explore, John Locke used a similar analogy as above in 1689, imagining the soul or consciousness of a prince being placed into the body of a recently deceased cobbler or shoemaker. For Locke, the identity or personhood follows the consciousness, such that the self-identity of the prince will be transferred with his consciousness, and while he may be a different man by all outward appearances, he is the same person. To further suss out the distinction between man and identity, Locke uses another analogy. Slide 4. If the same Socrates, waking and sleeping, do not partake of the same consciousness, then Socrates waking and sleeping is not the same person. To punish waking Socrates for what sleeping Socrates thought and waking Socrates was never conscious of would be no more right than to punish one twin for what another brother twin did or thought. From the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, if Socrates has a different consciousness by day than he does by night, then waking Socrates ought not be punished for what sleeping Socrates does. This is because, although Socrates is the same man by day as he is by night, he is a different person by day than he is by night, and moral responsibility lies with persons, according to Locke. These thought experiments may seem trivial, but they actually form the basis for a robust line of research in psychology: personality. Further, it is the meticulous dissecting of what a person is that Locke undergoes which form the basis for laws about how to convict somebody that may be insane and therefore the same man by all appearances, but not the same person they were during a crime. The downstream consequences of research on personality go well beyond online personality tests and touch upon who we are as individuals in a larger society. Slide 5. So in talking about personality, we're going to break it down into 3 super broad categories. One's going to be the history of personality theories. One is going to be personality traits, how we distinguish them from personality states. And then we're going to talk about specific personality assessments. Slide 6. Even before it was labeled personality, ideas to account for the behaviors and motivation of humans, essentially the nature and origin of personality, have long been of importance to both psychologists and everyday people. What accounts for the difference in the characteristics of individuals and in their behavior? More practically, how can one best judge other people's characters and know what to expect of them? In attempting to answer these questions, I hope you see that philosophers, proto-psychologists, and the regular citizen alike have an interest in the study of personality, and over the centuries, it has been repeatedly addressed from many different angles. Astrology is seen as the earliest known effort to assess personality, and then later, physiognomy is the attempt to glean personality traits based on features of the face, and was used by Hippocrates and Pythagoras in ancient Greece. Phrenology was all the rage in the 1800s, and it was like palm reading, but for your skull. That's right, based on a hands-on analysis of the anatomical pattern in the shape of your skull. Phrenologists like Franz Joseph Gall would reveal to you parts of your personality. Galen accounted for temperament with a theory about body fluids or humors, such that too much phlegm was correlated to being thoughtful and reasonable. Think about that the next time you catch a cold. You're not sick, just calm and thoughtful. To round out the theory, bile contributed to being choleric or aggressive, blood contributed to being sanguine or optimistic, and black bile contributed to being melancholic or depressed. The reasoning to account for these personality categories is absurd, but we'll soon find out that contemporary research still uses these terms when talking about temperament. Slide 7. But it was Christian Thomasius in the late 1600s, early 1700s that pioneered a technique that foreshadowed the future of personality research. Thomasius assigned numerical values to different personality attributes, and his analysis of personality laid out in New Discovery of a Solid Science Most Necessary for the Community for Discerning the Secrets of the Hearts of Other Men from Daily Conversation, even against their will. That just rolls off the tongue, doesn't it? Regardless. Now we have a model for testing personality and doing research on it. The test. Before we even get into the history of personality tests, let's define what we mean by personality. For the purposes of this class, personality will be defined as the stable, consistent ways in which each person's behavior differs from that of others, especially in social situations. With this definition in mind, we already run into some philosophical issues. Are these consistent ways that we behave a product of nature or nurture? Slide 8. Plato's notion that all the contents of the mind existed there before birth, and all we need to do is remember the knowledge that already exists there. Yeah, wrap your head around that. Received some pushback from philosophers like Aristotle and Democritus, who saw knowledge as arising from perceptions. Slide 9. René Descartes brought the Platonic into the 17th century by arguing that the mind's ideas are innate. But John Locke countered with his notion that we are born blank slates, waiting for the environment to write knowledge onto us. A logical extension of addressing questions about nature and nurture is to determine whether the innate genetic contribution, the nature, makes us inherently good or bad. That is, what should our view of human nature be? Because any theory about personality is going to be affected by your view of human nature. Slide 10. For a perspective on the view that human nature is bad, we have Freud. Admittedly, Freud's ideas are not in use much, but his ideas are important to think about because they had a major impact in psychology. His ideas spawned at least 4 different areas of psychological research, including developmental psychology, abnormal psychology, diagnoses, and treatments. And the topic for this lecture, personality, which is actually the core of Freud's psychoanalytic theory. So let's take a quick look at what he had to say. If you remember from the first lecture, we reviewed the philosophical precursors to psychology by reviewing Descartes, Locke, and Hume. And while these thinkers were focused on examining the conscious mind, Freud was different in that he sought to unlock the secrets of the unconscious mind. And when we reviewed the early era psychologists like Weber and Wundt, we saw that in studying sensation and perception, or psychophysics, they were trying to answer, how does the mind work? Freud, on the other hand, was interested in something a little bit different. He was trying to answer, what am I and what made me that way? And it is from there that we begin to see Freud's psychoanalytic theory as a personality theory. What am I and what made me that way? The answers to these questions for Freud are as follows. What am I, or what are we as humans? Well, we are a collection of thoughts, emotions, and actions, behaviors. And what makes you that way? Well, those are our motivations, and for Freud, our motivations were drives. For Freud, these drives are mostly at the unconscious level and therefore beyond our conscious control. And it is this concept of the unconscious that Freud popularized because it was the focus of his theory. In short, in answering what makes us this way, Freud posits that the unconscious is a repository of memories, emotions, and thoughts that affect our behavior, even though we cannot talk about them, and it is here in the unconscious that we force certain thoughts and emotions in order to deal with traumatic experiences and unresolved childhood conflicts. The goal of therapy is to bring those memories back to consciousness from the unconscious, producing catharsis and enabling the person to overcome irrational impulses. The analyst should listen intently to everything the patient says and help the patient explore possible meanings of each thought, memory, and action. The assumption is that simply understanding and bringing the unconscious material into consciousness is the key to psychological improvement. In that summary, we can see how this personality theory also envelops the topics of developmental psychology, abnormal psychology, diagnosis, and treatment. Slide 11. We've talked about Freud's contributions to developmental psychology in the lecture on development, and his contributions to abnormal psychology are going to be touched on in the next lecture. So for now, let's focus on the components of Freud's theory that weigh in on personality, specifically by delving into his three aspects of personality: the id, the ego, and the superego. Let's be clear. These three aspects of personality don't exist in any objective way. That is, they're not real entities, but instead concepts that give us an as-if model of personality. It's as if we have three aspects of personality whose inner dynamics cause them to push and pull against each other, resulting in our personality. So what are these concepts and why are they pushing and pulling against each other? Let's start with the id. The concept of the id is what Freud would consider the most basic aspect of personality that we are all born with. The id encompasses our sexual and biological drives that demand immediate gratification. That is, it's working on a pleasure principle, impatiently pursuing the pleasurable. Think of a baby, an infant, or a child as the prototype for the id. When they need to eat, be comforted, or have their diapers changed, they make it clear that these needs need to be met right now. There is little to no ability to delay gratification because their needs are urgent, and if not met, there will be hell to pay. So, for now, think of the id as your typical, needy, inner, petulant child. Remember, Freud thinks of humans as naturally bad. I mean, imagine the chaos in society if the id went unchecked. Insert joke about current political state of the world here. As we develop and grow older and more mature, the concept of the superego becomes established through the learning of rules or the do's and don'ts of our culture, taught to us by parents and others. This is like our conscience in that it's working on a moral principle instead of the pleasure principle. Think of a parent as the prototype for the superego. The superego keeps the id in check using its weapon of choice, guilt. While also doling out pride and satisfaction for accomplishments, guilt is the weapon of choice. And it is a hell of a penalty, and we can imagine this process going haywire, making us feel guilty over the most trivial mistakes. And admittedly, if all we had was the id and superego battling it out between pleasure and guilt, we'd be quite unstable. That's why we need the ego, The ego helps strike a balance and provide stability. In fact, the ego can be seen as the referee of the id and the superego by determining which arguments matter in reality. That is, the ego is working on the reality principle to balance the moral and pleasure principle. As we get older and have more experience in reality, the stronger our ego gets, and instead of dealing with every little argument, you have a picture of who you are, and that allows you to be more consistent in your behavior. This consistency is viewed and felt as your personality. And this interplay between the id, ego, and superego that makes up our personality is often referred to as Freud's psychodynamic theory, because it is built on the idea that personality is dependent on the dynamics between these three psychological concepts. Get it? Dynamics, psychological, psychodynamics. The method used for dealing with these psychodynamics when coping strategies and defense mechanisms fail is known as psychoanalysis. And as mentioned, we'll go more into this next chapter. Slide 12. Since Freud was so concerned about the unconscious, you'd be forgiven in asking how these three aspects of personality fit into his understanding of the conscious and unconscious. This is where the iceberg analogy is often used, such that the majority of an iceberg is below the surface of the water it's floating in, with only a small portion of it visible above the waterline. For Freud, the small, maybe 10% bit of an iceberg that is visible represents the conscious mind, while everything underwater represents the unconscious mind. For the purpose of this analogy, the waterline that separates the conscious from the unconscious mind represents a threshold or barrier that prevents the conscious mind from seeing what the unconscious mind is up to. That is, there is no direct access to the unconscious mind consciously. Remember, Freud thought most of our behaviors are motivated by unconscious drives. So, in addition to the id, ego, and superego, we're all dealing with two instinctual drives, the libido and death instinct. The libido was considered by Freud to be a life force we are born with that is made up of sexual energy. For the sake of clarity and brevity, I'd like for you to think of Freud's use of the word sexual as meaning pleasurable. So, remembering what we covered about the id, you can see that the id is working from the place of the libido, impatiently pursuing pleasure and gratification. But wait, there's more. We're also born with a destructive life force, the death instinct. That is, we are born aggressive, and this aggression is directed at ourselves, but the libido mediates or overcomes the death instinct. This doesn't mean our aggression goes away. It lurks in the unconscious mind and manifests in aggressive behaviors directed at others. Again, since we are born with both the libido and death energies at birth, they are the material that the id is working with, and now we know why the id needs to have a lid put on it. What is available to the conscious mind is a sliver of our superego and a bigger chunk of our ego, with all the rest of our mental activity occurring in the never-ending battle of the unconscious mind. And how we deal with this never-ending battle contributes to our personality, which, for Freud, was focused mostly on the level and cause of neuroses or anxiety and hysteria, since they were the diagnoses of his era. While hysteria is still used casually to describe that someone is overreacting, it's lost favor as a personality trait, while neurosis is still considered among the big 5 personality traits. More on that in a little bit. Slide 13. A student of Freud's who is also very influential in personality research is Carl Jung, who you may not have heard of, but he's responsible for a pop personality test called the Myers-Briggs Personality Inventory. According to Jung, people have not only a conscious mind and a personal unconscious, equivalent to Freud's unconscious, but also a collective unconscious mind. The collective unconscious, present at birth, relates to the cumulative experience of preceding generations. Whereas the conscious mind and the personal unconscious vary from one person to another, the collective unconscious is similar for nearly all people. It contains archetypes, which are vague images, or at least the predisposition to form images, that would always have been part of human experience. As evidence for this view, Jung pointed out similarities in the art of cultures throughout the world, as well as similarities in their myths and folklore. Carl Jung's theory of personality emphasized people's search for a spiritual meaning in life. In contrast to Freud, who traced much of adult personality to childhood events, Jung stressed the possibility of personality changes in adulthood. He also discussed the way people adopt a persona like a role in a play. That is, people try to make a certain impression while concealing parts of their true nature. Another of Jung's contributions was the idea of psychological types. He believed that people's personalities fell into a few distinct categories, such as being an extrovert or being an introvert, which, like Freud's contribution of neurosis or neuroticism, is still considered among the big five personality traits. Slide 14. Looking at personality theories that don't, like the Freudians, have a negative view of human nature, but rather a positive view of human nature, that is, people are essentially good and strive to achieve potential, we turn to humanistic psychology. Humanistic psychology emerged in the 1950s and 60s as a protest against both behaviorism and psychoanalysis. Behaviorists and psychoanalysts often emphasize the less noble aspects of people's thoughts and actions, whereas humanistic psychologists see people as essentially good and striving to achieve their potential. Also, behaviorism and psychoanalysis, despite their differences, both assume determinism, or the belief that every behavior has a cause. And they also believe in reductionism, which is the attempt to explain behavior in terms of its component elements. Humanistic psychologists do not try to explain behavior in terms of its parts or hidden causes. They claim that people are free to make deliberate, conscious decisions. More specifically, humanistic psychology deals with consciousness, values, and abstract beliefs, including spiritual experiences and the beliefs that people live and die for, or their meaning and values. According to humanistic psychologists, personality depends on people's beliefs and perceptions of the world. If you believe that a particular experience was highly meaningful, then it was highly meaningful. This should sound familiar because this idea that perceptions of the world are what matter is the same idea that the early philosophers like Hume and psychophysicists like Weber and Wundt. The main difference being, instead of using perception as an object for study, humanistic psychologists used it for clinical and therapeutic purposes. So, with this background in mind, let's look at a couple of the more popular humanistic psychologists, Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow. Slide 15. According to Carl Rogers, it is as natural for people to strive for excellence as it is for a plant to grow. People evaluate themselves and their actions beginning in childhood. They develop a self-concept, an image of what they really are, and an ideal self, an image of what they would like to be. Rogers measured self-concept and ideal self by devising a method known as a Q sort. He would hand someone a stack of cards containing statements such as, I am honest and I am suspicious of others, etc. And the person would then sort the statements into piles representing true of me and not true of me, or arrange them in a continuum from most true of me to least true of me. Then Rogers would provide an identical stack of cards and ask the person to sort them into two piles, true of my ideal self and not true of my ideal self. In this manner, he can compare someone's self-concept to his or her ideal self. People who perceive much discrepancy between their self-concept and their ideal self generally feel distress. Humanistic psychologists try to help people overcome their distress by improving their self-concept or by revising their ideal self. To promote human welfare, Rogers maintained that people should relate to one another with unconditional positive regard, which is the complete, unqualified acceptance of another person as he or she is. If you feel unconditional positive regard, you might disapprove of someone's actions or intentions, but you still accept and love that person anyway. If you ask me, the world needs a little more unconditional positive regard. Am I right? Slide 16. Abraham Maslow, another humanistic psychologist, complained that most psychologists concentrated on disordered personalities, assuming that personality is either normal or worse than normal. A clear nod of disapproval toward the Freudians and their imprint on clinical psychology, looking for what was wrong instead of what was right in people. Maslow insisted that personality can also do better than normal. He emphasized self-actualization, the achievement of one's full potential. According to Maslow, people with a self-actualized or self-actualizing personality show the following characteristics. An accurate perception of reality. They perceive the world as it is, not as they would like it to be, and they accept uncertainty and ambiguity. Independence, creativity, and spontaneity. They make their own decisions, even if others disagree. Acceptance of themselves and others. They treat people with unconditional positive regard. A problem-centered outlook rather than a self-centered outlook. They think about how to solve problems, not how to make themselves look good. And finally, enjoyment of life. They are open to positive experiences, including peak experiences, when they feel truly fulfilled and content. Oh, that wasn't the final one. The final one is a good sense of humor. That helps, right? How can you enjoy life without a good sense of humor? Slide 17. An updated version of Maslow's theory, based on a study of his personality journals and notebooks, is offered by Scott Barry Kaufman, who is right over the bridge at University of Pennsylvania. Kaufman begins by disabusing everybody of the notion that Maslow's theory is meant to be shown as a pyramid, like I just did. Apparently, that pyramid was the result of a bastardization of Maslow's theory by a management consultant in the 1960s. A more appropriate analogy, according to Kaufman, would be a boat with the body comprised of the components of security, safety, connection, and self-esteem. The sail would be made of the components of growth, exploration, love, and purpose. And with a sail of growth open, navigating a boat of security, you can not only stay afloat in life, but strive beyond growth to transcendence, which, according to Kaufman, is a perspective in which we can view our whole being from a higher vantage point with acceptance, which transcends right or wrong, wisdom, which transcends smart or not, and a sense of connectedness with the rest of humanity, which transcends the boundary between me and you. I bring Kaufman up as an update to humanistic psychology in general and Maslow specifically because, 1, his book just recently dropped, Transcend, the New Science of Self-Actualization. I read it, I love it, I recommend it. And 2, he also happens to be a personality researcher. With this in mind, Kaufman shows how, in addition to Freud's contribution of neuroticism and Jung's contribution of introversion versus extroversion, the humanistic psychologists were pivotal in showing that there are more positive personality traits to consider. Rogers' unconditional positive regard requires a level of conscientiousness and agreeableness that wasn't appreciated by Freud or Jung. And further, it should be clear that reaching self-actualization requires a certain openness to experience. Slide 18. Okay, so we have finished the history of personality theories, kind of going over the psychodynamic or Freudian theories, which kind of has a human nature perspective that we're born bad, and then the humanistic perspective, which is the nature-nurture position that we are born good. Okay, so from those two different positions, I think you have an idea of what our personality is and how we would go about thinking about it. Now, how do we go about testing it? Haha, funny you should ask. Slide 19. While providing insight about the underpinnings of personality, neither the psychoanalytic approach of Freud and Jung nor the humanistic approach of Rogers and Maslow afforded a way to quickly and accurately measure personality in the same way as intelligence. But, unlike the results of intelligence tests, personality tests and their history are interwoven into clinical psychology because the first personality tests were used to determine problems with people. Specifically, with the United States entering World War I in 1917, the Army needed a way to quickly determine if recruits were emotionally disturbed and looked to Robert S. Woodworth to throw something together to screen for this. The resulting Personal Data Sheet Questionnaire is one of the first tests of personality. As primitive and limited as it was, the Personal Data Sheet Questionnaire set a pattern for the use of self-rating questionnaires to assess personality after the war. In the late 1930s, two researchers at the University of Minnesota developed another personality test aimed at detecting pathology, the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, or MMPI. For this, the researchers generated questions and gave them to diagnosed and undiagnosed populations to see how the population's answers were different. We'll talk more about this later. The point being, by the 1930s, personality was a distinct field in psychology, resting on the shoulders of research looking for deviance from the norm and dominated by trait theory. Slide 20. Well, what exactly is a personality trait? What is trait theory, you might ask? And indeed, it's funny that you ask because I just so happen to have the answer for that question. Traits are personality characteristics that persist over time. They are a recognizable and consistent set of characteristics and tendencies in behavior on particular situations like shyness or hostility or talkativeness. Traits are contrasted in psychological research with states. States are temporary tendencies in response to particular situations. For example, being nervous most of the time is a trait, but being afraid right now is a state. And while temporary states are interesting, psychological research in personality has followed the trait approach. That is, the study and measurement of consistent personality characteristics. That's what the trait theory is. Slide 21. The emphasis on personality traits was bolstered by Gordon Allport. Through his studies and 1937 book, Personality, a Psychological Interpretation, Allport put to bed notions of a time that attempted to downplay the role of traits of personality. These were researchers that concluded that even if traits did exist, they don't cause individuals to behave similarly in the same situation. Starting with his research in graduate school on what he termed ascension and submission, or aggression and submission, Allport developed his own paper and pencil tests to demonstrate that people tend to consistently occupy a given spot on the continuum from ascendance to submission. This began a career in personality research for Allport that always considered traits the fundamental, stable unit of personality. Slide 22. So how do we get to what we have now? And what we have now are the big 5 personality traits. Let's talk about how they were derived. So I'm going to bring up Francis Galton again. And in case you don't remember, Sir Francis Galton is Darwin's cousin, and he came up with the statistical analysis of correlation in 1888, which allows us to measure the variance of one variable while another varies. Decades later, Charles Spearman came up with factor analysis. Factor analysis allows us to look at correlations between many different variables. For instance, we may observe variance in a dozen variables that's really the function of the variance of 2 or 3 underlying variables. In the 1940s, Hans J. Eysenck applied factor analysis to data derived from the MMPI. And if you hear something here, my cat just jumped in my lap. And his own personality test, and found that the variance in all these data points was due to 4 factors. When he plotted these 4 factors, they bore a striking resemblance to the 4 temperaments posited by Galen and his body fluid theory. Before then, in 1936, Allport and H.S. Odbert applied factor analysis to a set of thousands of words that might be used to describe personality. They deleted from this list words that were merely evaluations, such as nasty, and terms referring to temporary states, such as confused. In the remaining list, they looked for clusters of synonyms, such as affectionate, warm, and loving, and kept only one of the terms. When they found opposites, such as honest and dishonest, they also kept just one term. After eliminating synonyms and antonyms, Raymond Cattell and a student, Charles Spearman, right, the same one that came up with factor analysis, narrowed the original list to 35 and then 16 traits. In addition to Cattell and Eysenck, other laboratories were applying factor analysis to personality descriptors, looking for clusters of traits that correlate strongly with one another but don't correlate with the other clusters. Using this approach, researchers have come to find 5 core personality traits, even though the methods and labels of the traits may have differed over time. The big 5 personality traits, or the 5-factor model, are emotional stability, which is the positive spin on the word neuroticism, extroversion, which is the opposite of introversion, agreeableness, conscientiousness, and openness to new experience. Slide 23. The case for these 5 traits is that 1. Each correlates with many personality dimensions for which our language has a word, and 2. None of these traits correlates highly with any of the other 4, so they are not measuring the same thing. So another way to say this is wherever you fall on, say, the extroversion-introversion continuum, this says nothing about how agreeable or disagreeable you are. Slide 24. So let's just take a closer look at each of these personality traits. Emotional stability. Emotional stability, or neuroticism, is a tendency to minimize unpleasant emotions. The opposite term, as I mentioned, is neuroticism, and neuroticism correlates positively with anxiety, hostility, self-consciousness, frequent conflicts with other people, and many physical and mental illnesses. Therefore, emotional stability correlates with self-control, good relations with others, and mental health. Extroversion is a tendency to seek stimulation and to enjoy the company of other people. The opposite of extroversion is introversion. Extroversion is associated with warmth, gregariousness, assertiveness, impulsiveness, and a need for excitement. The unpleasant side of extroversion is an increased chance of alcohol abuse and other risky behaviors. The pleasant side is that extroverts tend to feel good and report high life satisfaction. Agreeableness is a tendency to be compassionate towards others. It implies a concern for the welfare of other people and is closely related to Adler's concept of social interest. People high in agreeableness trust other people and expect other people to trust them. They are more likely than average to have stable marriages and stable employment, and they are less likely than average to have prejudices. Conscientiousness is a tendency to show self-discipline, to be dutiful, and to strive for achievement and competence. People high in conscientiousness work hard and complete their tasks on time. They exercise, eat a healthy diet, and in general, act to advance their health and longevity. Openness to experience is a tendency to enjoy new intellectual experiences and new ideas. People high in this trait enjoy modern art, unusual music, and thought-provoking films and books. They also enjoy meeting unusual people and exploring new ideas. So a quick way to memorize these 5 traits is with a mnemonic device, and you just use an anagram. So the first letter of each of these, if we use neuroticism, extroversion, agreeableness, conscientiousness, openness, you can either spell the word ocean or canoe. So the best way to memorize the 5-factor model, ocean or canoe. Also, extra credit if you take an online personality test and send me the results. Extra credit. Take an online personality test and send me the results. Only people who are listening to this lecture will get this bonus result. Slide 25. Now that we know what the big 5 are and what contributes to them, let's shift our focus on how we test them. First, we should look carefully at how personality was measured before we draw conclusions because, as humans, we're prone to biases, mental shortcuts, and faulty thinking. An example is the Barnum effect, the tendency to accept vague descriptions of one's own personality. Because of these biases, most people accept almost any interpretation of their personality. Think horoscopes. On top of that, personality is genuinely difficult to measure because human behavior is not entirely consistent, and personality is mostly tested using self-report, which can be wildly inaccurate. If we want to know whether a test measures personality, we cannot simply ask for people's opinions. Just think of how you would rate yourself on personality dimensions. Then think of how your parents, siblings, or friends would rate you on those same dimensions. It's quite likely that there will be a discrepancy in ratings because we know our intentions but can't observe our behaviors, while others can see our behaviors but don't have direct access to our intentions. For these reasons, testing the Big 5 needs to be done rigorously. Slide 26. That is, psychologists need to design a test carefully and then determine its reliability and validity. As a reminder, reliability has to do with consistency, while validity has to do with accuracy. If you're still confused about validity and reliability, the figure on this slide shows an example of what validity and reliability look like. On the first target, our shooter's aim is all over the place. It is neither reliable, consistent, or valid, accurate. The second or middle target demonstrates consistency, but it is reliably off target or invalid. So we have a high level of reliability or consistency, but no accuracy whatsoever. That cluster of bullets isn't near the bullseye. The third and final target represents a reliable and valid result. The person is able to hit the target accurately and also consistently. The grouping is good, it's tight, it's consistent, and it also happens to be in the place it's supposed to be, which makes it accurate. This is what you aim for in research. An instrument can be reliable without being valid, but it cannot be valid without also being reliable. The reliability and validity of a test can be determined and maintained through the process called standardization. A standardized test has a specific way it is to be administered and a specific way to interpret the results to maintain the reliability and validity. Slide 27. An important step in standardizing is determining the distribution of scores, as we saw in the lecture on intelligence testing. Such information determines whether a particular score on a personality test is within the normal range or whether it is more typical of people with a disorder. Slide 28. Okay, so what kind of personality tests are out there? The two main go-to legitimate, reliable, and valid tests for the Big 5 personality traits are the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, or the MMPI-2, which is used for clinical assessment, and the Neurotic Extroversion Openness Personality Inventory Revised, or the NEOPIR, LMNOP, used for non-clinical assessment. The MMPI consists of a series of true-false questions selected in an effort to distinguish among various personality types. The original MMPI was devised empirically, so let's use it for this week's methods review. If, based on our observations, we hypothesize that there is a difference between the personalities of people with a diagnosed mental or emotional disorder and those without disorders, how would we design a study to test this hypothesis and answer the research question? First, we need access to two populations, those with and those without the specific mental or emotional diagnosis. These will serve as our experimental and control groups. Second, we can develop an inventory or questionnaire of yes-no statements about personality and administer it to both samples. Third, after collecting data from our samples, we analyze it for differences between the groups on test scores. If we find statistically significant differences between the groups, our hypothesis is supported. If we don't, our hypothesis is not supported, or the null hypothesis is supported. Well, this is essentially what happened in the development of the MMPI. The authors developed a test that had hundreds of statements that they thought might relate to personality, like, I am happy most of the time. I enjoy social gatherings just to be with people. I believe I am a condemned person. And then they put these questions to A, people with various psychological disorders, and B, a group of hospital visitors who were assumed to be psychological normal. Assumed. The researchers selected the items that most people in any clinical group answered differently from most normal people. They assumed, for example, that if your answers resemble those of people with depression, you probably are depressed as well. The MMPI includes scales for depression, paranoia, schizophrenia, as well as others. To bring the MMPI up to date, psychologists eliminated obsolete terms and added new ones to deal with drug abuse, suicidal thoughts, and other issues. Then, they standardized the new MMPI-2 on a large representative sample of the U.S. population. The MMPI also guards against lying. How? By including items about common faults and rare virtues. Slide 29. The NEO-PIR, which is a more recent personality test, is based on the Big Five personality model as well. It includes 240 items to measure neuroticism, extroversion, openness, agreeableness, and conscientiousness. Just remember, ocean or canoe. Unlike the MMPI, which is meant as a measure of psychopathology and personality, the NEO-PIR is intended mainly to measure normal personality. Slide 30. So, what contributes to personality? Well, that places us right back at nature-nurture. As we discussed at the beginning of the lecture, determining what aspects of personality are due to environmental factors as compared to genetic factors is an important distinction. So let's start with nurture. While trait theory helps explain a portion of the pie that makes up personality, events in the environment can affect personality as well. But we also don't want to go full behaviorist, since Skinner did view personality as, and I quote, an explanatory fiction, a device for representing a functionally unified system of responses, end quote. Notice that he framed personality as a response or behavior. Always with the behavioral responses, this one. In 1941, a couple of Yale scientists, John Dollard and Neil Miller, published Social Learning and Imitation as a way of reinterpreting Freudian theory into stimulus response, based on their research with rats. In an attempt to expand on behaviorism, Dollard and Miller said that much learning is social and takes place through cognitive processes as well as reflexive drives and needs. That is, human behavior and personality are shaped not only by rewarded actions, but by the individual's predictions and expectations based on what they have observed that specific behaviors will yield certain rewards. You can see the behaviorist model beginning to bend towards cognition in the 50s, and a modification to social learning was made by Julian Rotter to include a trait-like modification. Rotter sought a line of research to determine where people stood on questions of locus of control as a way of determining the effects of life-changing events on personality. That is, when something good or bad happens and you consistently attribute it to circumstances, you're said to have an external locus of control. Think about the attribution theories we were talking about. But if you attribute the events to yourself and what you've done, you're said to have an internal locus of control. Take a look at some of these questions from the internal-external locus of control scale. Many of the unhappy things in people's lives are partly due to bad luck, versus people's misfortunes result from the mistakes they make. Or how about this one? In the long run, people get the respect they deserve, versus, unfortunately, an individual's worth often passes unrecognized, no matter how hard they try. What about this last one? Becoming a success is a matter of hard work. Luck has little or nothing to do with it, as compared to getting a good job depends mainly on being in the right place at the right time. You can see that, depending on which answer you choose, these kinds of questions determine over a range of situations whether you have an internal or external locus of control. Research on locus of control has led to an interesting line of study about what is termed learned helplessness. This is a concept developed right across the bridge at University of Pennsylvania by Martin Seligman in the 1960s. In short, Seligman and colleagues were able to show that if you learn in one situation that there is nothing you can do to stop a painful event, this helplessness transfers to other events such that even if there is something you can do to reduce the pain, you won't, because you've already learned in the other situation that there's nothing you can do to help yourself. Seligman applied this to depression by positing that when a painful event is experienced, depression can be induced if the person uses an internal locus of control and blames themselves. Social learning theory, as well as research on locus of control and learned helplessness, justify the belief that there are facets of personality that can be strongly affected by events in the environment, or nurture. Slide 31. Moving on to nature. Much research trying to tease apart influences of nature and nurture on psychological phenomenon, like personality, rely on studies of twins and adopted children. Studies indicated greater similarities in extroversion between monozygotic pairs than dizygotic pairs. Similar research shows a hereditary component to neuroticism, conscientiousness, and other personality traits. However, careful studies of the genome, which is all of the chromosomes, have found no identifiable gene with a major effect on personality. Evidently, a great many genes influence personality, each in a small way, combined with environmental influences, the very ones we just reviewed. Researchers have compared personalities of parents, their biological children, and their adopted children. Results have shown that biological relatives, siblings or parents and children, showed low positive correlations, and people related by adoption had close to zero correlations. The low correlations between adopted children and adoptive parents imply that children learn rather little of their personalities by imitating their parents. In addition to the role of genetics, much of the variation among people's personality relates to the unshared environment and the special experiences that vary from one person to another, even within a family. Slide 32. Other factors to look at when looking for contributors to personality include how personality changes as you age, whether comparing someone to their younger selves or looking at older cohorts versus younger cohorts at any time in history, and how culture influences personality. Let's start with age. How will your personality change in the future? In general, the older people get, the more slowly they change. One reason for personality to become more fixed is that older people usually stay in the same environment, doing the same things year after year. Although the differences that occur over age are not large, some trends are consistent. One trend, found in cultures throughout the world, is that middle-aged people tend to be more conscientious than teenagers. Most people reach their peak of social vitality and sensation-seeking during adolescence or early childhood, and then decline gradually with further age. Looking at culture, when comparing personality among cultures or countries, research relying on self-reports encounters a bit of difficulty here. When people rate themselves, they compare themselves to others within the country, and therefore their ratings are not necessarily a good gauge of what the country as a whole does. Also, people in some countries are more likely to use the extremes of a scale, whereas those in other countries usually stay close to the middle of the scale. Therefore, self-ratings from one country are not easily comparable to those from another. The best way to compare personalities across cultures is to observe actual behavior. And then finally, talking about cohorts. So researchers have found generational differences in personality. So generations and cohorts are kind of the same, right? As generations go by, each generation represents a different cohort. So baby boomers is one cohort as compared to Gen Xers, which is another cohort, and then millennials, et cetera, et cetera. Measurements of anxiety have gradually increased over the decades so that normal people now report anxiety levels that used to characterize people in mental hospitals. American teenagers today report more desire for wealth than teenagers of the past did, while also reporting less intention to work real hard. Let's see how that works. Slide 33. While we have focused on questionnaires, they are only one of several ways to measure personality, although it is quick, easy, reliable, and accurate. Depending on what resources are available to you, a researcher could always do an analysis of personality based on personal documents like memoirs or diaries, or you can do an extensive interview. But these aren't very useful for normal populations and cater more to diagnosing distinct mental or emotional disorders. Ratings of personality factors can also be done by trained raters who code behavior based on a standardized model. Other non-questionnaire assessments of personality are still used, and these are called projective techniques. A projective technique such as the Inkblot or Rorschach test or the thematic apperception test, TAT, lets people describe their concerns indirectly while talking about ambiguous stimuli. The Rorschach Inkblots are the most famous, and they're the most widely used. And they're the most controversial projective personality technique. Popular in the 1930s, the Rorschach Inkblot technique consists of 10 cards with abstract patterns. A psychologist hands you a card and asks, "What might this be?" The assumption is that you describe what you see, your answer relates in some way to your experiences, concerns, and personality. Therefore, parts of your unconscious and personality will be revealed. Critics argue that the Rorschach seldom gives information that one could not obtain from biographical reports or other sources, and sometimes gives a false impression. They doubt that the Rorschach is worth the bother of administering, and strongly insist that no one should use it to make important decisions or diagnoses. Defenders of the Rorschach insist that when it's properly used, its validity is comparable to that of many other psychological tests or questionnaires. Unfortunately, the other tests also show only low to moderate validity. In 1935, the TAT, or thematic apperception test, was developed and consisted of 31 ambiguous pictures like the one shown on this slide of a student looking at a book. A psychologist selects a few cards to use with a given client. The person is then asked to make up a story for each picture, describing what events led up to the scene, what is happening now, and what will happen in the future. The assumption is that when you tell a story about someone in the drawing, you probably identify with that person, and so the story is really about yourself. You might describe events and concerns that you might be reluctant to discuss openly if you are asked explicitly. The results of the TAT are useful for research purposes, although not necessarily for making decisions about an individual. Other projective techniques include word association, which is presenting a word and then having somebody say the first thing that comes into their mind. There's also sentence completion tasks where you have to fill in the word of a sentence like, I only wish my mother had blank. And there are also drawing tests that are effective ways to produce content that can be deconstructed for analyzing personality, right? The creative arts therapies are very good for this. Slide 34. And now we wrap it up with how personality tests are used and misused. Personality tests are useful up to a point, but we need to be aware of their limits, right? This is not a limitless amount of greatness that we can get out of this instrument. Because the tests aren't entirely accurate, a score that seems characteristic of a psychological disorder may occur also in many people without that disorder. Therefore, although the personality test provides a helpful cue, a psychologist must look for evidence beyond the test score before drawing a conclusion. Let's take a look at criminal profiling. Criminal profiling, also known as behavioral investigative advice, attempts to infer something about the criminal from the crime itself. Criminal profiling is an application of personality testing. It assumes that people who commit similar crimes have similar personalities or backgrounds. Some psychologists try to aid police investigations by constructing personality profiles of the kind of person who would commit a certain crime. Research has shown that the accuracy of criminal profiling is not high, but it sure does make for good drama. Silence of the Lambs wouldn't exist if Clarice didn't need the help of Hannibal Lecter in profiling a serial killer. And what would my parents watch after they've caught up on the Weather Channel if it weren't for marathon syndication series of CSI or Criminal Minds? As one of many examples, the world got to see the failings of profiling in 2002 when a series of killings in the Washington, D.C. area caught the nation's attention and news channels were covering the days-long shooting spree. The experts were convinced and confidently reported they were looking for a single, white suspect, likely a gun enthusiast in his mid-20s. When the shooters, yes, plural, were caught and brought in, they were found to be gun enthusiasts, but that's about the only similarity between the profile and the actual shooters. Neither were in their 20s, one was in his 40s and the other was a teenager, and the 40-year-old had a wife and children. In studies that pit professional profilers against untrained individuals, profilers barely do better than the untrained in inferring personality traits of actual murderers from details about their crimes. This also goes for attempts to gauge an offender's physical traits, thinking patterns, or personal habits. So, why do we think profiling is accurate? Well, first, the media will mostly report on cases where the profile successfully matches the convicted. Second, since profilers claim to have an expertise, we as humans have a mental shortcut that makes us prone to believe such claims of expertise. It's like a mental loophole. Lastly, profilers fill their profiles with statements that are ambiguous enough to not mean anything, but be convincing nonetheless. Again, this is an effect called the P.T. Barnum effect, which allows vague descriptions to be interpreted as meaningful. Slide 35. And we have finished talking about personality. In doing so, we covered its history. We talked about personality traits and the Big Five. What contributes to personality? Also, we talked about specific personality assessments and how they can be used and misused. I hope you enjoyed it. See you on the next lecture.